Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Hopefully you saw the prompt in the chat. Please feel free to continue working on that. I just want to see who's on the call or in the session with us today. I'm going to kick us off by sharing my screen. So just give me a couple of seconds and we will get started. Hey, so let's jump right in. Hopefully you got time to put your responses in the chat, your name, role, physical location, so what city you are zooming in from, and then your mind shift song. So it's a song that always puts you in the mood. The song that I introed us with is called This Is Me. It is a song from The Greatest Showman. I love that song because it just reaffirms that everyone should show up as their authentic self. And it's a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about today. And so I'm so grateful that you all are spending the afternoon with me or part of your afternoon with me. But let's dive right in. Hopefully technology complies today. So welcome everyone to Unapologetically Me, embracing identity and developing culturally responsive environments. We're going to do a quick intro. I'm going to introduce myself and the grant-funded project that I work with. My name is Dr. Juliet Anyanwu, and I'm a program support specialist with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. It's a CDE grant-funded project out of El Dorado County Office of Education and also Riverside County Office of Education. I'm from the EDCO side of the house, but I'm physically located in Valencia, California. And so I support schools in Southern California. Basically, we provide technical assistance to educational communities in their pursuit of the design and redesign of inclusive practices. And so our work stretches across the state of California. And we support now 75 plus grantees throughout the state. CDE, we are constantly growing and supporting more and more grantees. And so we collaborate with CDE in supporting our grantees in their mission to fulfill inclusion, whatever that means for them. And so if you're interested in finding out more about our project, here's a QR code to scan. It takes you to this one pager that really gives just a general overview of our project, what we do, what type of tiered supports we provide, how you can get in contact with us, our website. Our website has a ton of information and resources around supporting inclusive practices in all settings. And so feel free to scan that QR code and get access to that one pager. In addition to that, just wanted to highlight that we do have a Padlet that I've curated for the purpose of this conference. And we will share the link out to the Padlet at the end of our session. So you leave the session with a lot of resources that you can utilize wherever you are, your school site, in whatever capacity that you're in. And so if you want to access the Padlet right now, I know there are people who just can't wait. You have the QR code in front of you, and so you can scan that on your device. But know that at the end of our time together today, we will share out the link to the actual Padlet, which has my slide deck, the one pager, and a ton of resources for you to utilize as you are implementing this work in your setting. And so let's do an overview of the learning targets. We have three big ones for today. The first is that we're just going to ground ourselves and have a better understanding of the essential components of an identity-safe classroom. We're also going to learn how to incorporate funds of knowledge. If you're not familiar with that term, we're going to talk about it a little bit, to design inclusive learning spaces. And then lastly, we're going to identify how we can implement culturally responsive practices within the classroom. So we have three big learning targets that are in front of us, but I'm going to walk you through it together. And so every time I walk into a space, sometimes we have to shift and pivot our mindsets in order to ensure that we're showing up at 100% or as wherever we're at. It doesn't have to be 100%. We might be functioning on 50%, 80%, wherever you are, come as you are in this space. And so during this session, I want to encourage you and empower you to take control of your own learning by entering into this brave space. And so think of these as norms. So as your presenter, I'll be sharing stories about myself and my upbringing and my experience in the US system, educational system. And these experiences are personal for me. And so because I'm modeling vulnerability, I ask you to do so as well too. And so some of you may be compelled to also share your personal experiences during the activity that we have to kick us off. So I ask everyone to just be open to learning and growth. Lean into some discomfort if that's what you're experiencing. Accept and expect non-disclosure or non-closure and unanswered questions. Share from your own experiences, but also work hard to understand and be mindful of the voices and perspectives that we're hearing in this space. And also communicate when you need support. And so feel free to unmute yourself, feel free to use the chat. Just want to ensure that we are coming into this space with an open mindset, because it will take some bravery to share with people that you might not know. But I'm going to model vulnerability, and hopefully that will inspire you to do the same. And so, like I said, our first activity, I'm going to share a little bit about my personal story and actually what brought me into presenting on this topic. So before we dive into the content, I just wanted to take a moment for us to reflect on our identities through this grounding activity. I experienced this activity maybe 4 or 5 years ago at a symposium, and it really changed the way I showed up as an educational leader, how I showed up for my students, my colleagues. And so I was looking forward to this opportunity of sharing this with you in hopes that you can utilize it in whatever space that you are operating in. And so be mindful that I engaged this activity through the lens of a student. And so this is just me being unapologetically me. And so I engaged in this activity through the lens of a student, a little girl who immigrated to the US at the age of 7 and was quickly reminded when I got here that I was different in a bad way. And there was no space for me to be unapologetically me. And so I did this activity for all the teachers who just didn't know or see me. And this is what I wish they knew through the many faces of Juliet. And so this is the first picture, actually school picture I took in the States. This was my first grade picture. And so this is Juliet. She just was very different. A lot of teachers didn't know what to make of me. And so I keep this picture. My mom actually gave me this picture a couple of years ago. Just as a reminder, when I think of Juliet, I think about the experiences I had coming to the US because I didn't speak grammatically correct English. I had to repeat the first grade, and that was very challenging for me because I was in a space where I know I knew more than everyone else, but because I didn't speak grammatically correct English at the first grade. So already I had a bad taste in my mouth entering the US educational system, because that showed me what they truly valued. It wasn't about education, it was how well you spoke. And I thought school was the opposite. So that's neither here or there, but that's Juliet. But my birth name is actually Chinyere. And so overnight I went from Chinyere to Juliet. And Chinyere in Nigeria means God's gift. And so that's another lens. This was the last picture I actually took in Nigeria before I came to the States. And so this is the little girl that I wish my first grade teachers knew. Chinyere, I felt like when I walked into the classroom doors, I had to leave Chinyere at home and I had to show up as Juliet. And so I think about how many of our students feel like they have to leave that part of them when they walk through our doors and show up as something else. And so there wasn't a space for me for Chinyere to show up. I had to operate as Juliet. In addition, I also wanted my teachers to know that I'm a proud Nigerian immigrant. There was no space for me to share my culture in my classroom. Like I said, it was always and I think my teachers had good intentions, but I think the drive for them was that, I have to assimilate. I need to fit in somehow. And so that was one thing I wanted my teachers to know about me, and create a space where I could share about my culture and learn about my peers' culture as well too, but that never occurred for me. Me think, what are our students experiencing in our classroom? Are we creating a space where they can show up with all of their identities, their background, their culture being one of them? Another thing I wanted my teachers to know, I'm innately introverted, so I am not an extrovert. You put me in a group space initially and I'm quiet. It doesn't mean that I don't know what's happening or I don't know enough to complete the project, but I'm just really quiet. I take a long time to process. I like to be in my mind first before I show up. And so oftentimes teachers would think that I was lazy. They would call me lazy in front of my parents. And so I knew more, but I just needed time to process before I got into a group space. A lot of the people around me was like, when they loved group work because they just jumped right in, and that wasn't me. And for me, I felt like that was a bad thing, and I got dinged for it a lot. And so it makes me think, how many of our students are innately introverted and just need time in order to be in a group space or in a larger space? But I'm also loquacious. And so it took a lot of work for me to dig these pictures, y'all. So I hope you appreciate all of this. Like, it took a lot of digging to find my ID from 1995, 1996 at Perry Middle School. I'm also loquacious. Even though I'm introverted, once you get me into a space where I feel safe and comfortable, you cannot get me to stop talking. And this also hurt me too as a student, because when my teachers couldn't get, I always got a bad rap. My mouth was always open. I was always talking. It was just me expressing that I was safe and I was comfortable. And I thought that's what teachers wanted. So I felt like I was stuck. If I was too quiet, I got in trouble. If I was too noisy, I got in trouble. And so, but I had to throw in that SAT word, loquacious. I had to use that. Also, I'm inquisitive. This was something that I always asked why, even today as an adult, and some of my teammates are annoyed by it, but I still do it because I want to know why. What is the reason? I'm inquisitive. It's not because I'm trying to challenge authority. And that's what my teachers thought. Because I was asking why, they thought that I was trying to challenge their authority. No, the reason why I asked why is that in Nigerian homes, or most Nigerian homes, I'm not trying to stereotype, in my Nigerian home, I couldn't really ask why because I couldn't question my parents. It was a sign of like disrespect. And so when I came to school, I was that child who wanted to know why around everything, because at home I couldn't ask that question. And so that's what I wanted my teachers to know about me. But also lastly, that I'm someone's daughter and I'm someone's sister, so treat me as such. And so these are the things that make up me as a student. And this is what I wanted my teachers to know about the many faces of Juliet. And so now that I've modeled this for you, I would love for you to engage in this activity. Again, when I did this 5 years ago, it really changed the way I saw myself as an educator and how I showed up for not only my K-12 students, but the residents that I'm teaching, the new teachers that I'm getting ready to go into the classroom. I also modeled that type of vulnerability with them too. And so I would love for you to engage in this activity. I'm doing a time check. And so I wanted to give you at least like 5, 6 minutes for you to engage with this activity. We're going to drop a link in the chat. The reason why I'm asking you to do this is that I would love to see more activities like this happening in classrooms. There are so many teachers that I coach. I work with new teachers in my residency program that I'm like, what part of your students do you know? And they really can't answer the question for me. You got to know our students. And in order to know them, you got to know yourself. So what's the identity? The prompt I want you to really grapple with as you engage in this activity. So in your role as an educational leader, which each of you are in your own right, whether it's a classroom teacher, a principal, a related service provider, what dominant identities are prevalent for you when you interact with your students? Is it your race? Is it your ethnicity? Is it your ability level? Is it your gender, your language, your sexuality, your personality? What comes up for you when you are interacting with students or even families? And so I want you to write them on the web. In addition to that, I want you to list on the side, what do you think are your students' dominant identities? I don't want you to make assumptions, but at least we're going to have a place to start. What do you think are their dominant identities, or what would they say if you asked them this question? And so we're going to put a link to the fillable identity wheel. Feel free to use it. If not, just get a post-it and start jotting down notes. Like, what identities come up for you? What do you think are some dominant identities of your student? This activity is going to prep you for a breakout room. I want to model vulnerability and give you an opportunity to share your story. I got to share with you. Thank you. I got to share with you what I couldn't share with my teachers. And I want you not to hold in what you are sharing. I want you to be able to share with someone else. Again, this is a brave, safe space for you. And so let's take about 5 minutes. You have the link to the fillable identity wheel. So you can use it, or you can use it in your classroom. And then I want you to list your identities, your students' identities, and then we'll get into breakout rooms. So let's do 5 minutes of quiet time, and then we'll come back and get into breakout rooms. Okay, about 2 more minutes, and then we're going to open up some breakout rooms. So if you're still working on your identity wheel or listing the uh, dominant identities of your students that you think they would share with you, I'm actually going to share what you're going to do in breakout rooms together. And so I have 2 questions that I want you all to um, discuss. Also, if these questions are not resonating with you, feel free to just share in general. And so you don't have to follow this format, but I wanted to give you some guidance as you get into breakout rooms. So breakout moments, this is your breakout moment. So with your identity wheel, what identities do you share with your students? So what you listed in your identity wheel versus what you listed of your students. So if you didn't get a chance to, would there be any similarities or commonalities that you share with your students? If there are some connections or commonalities, how can you use these connections to be an ally to your students? Also, if there are differences between you and your students, what opportunities are there for you to better understand your students? And so these are 2 questions I would love for you to discuss in your breakout rooms, but feel free, whatever feeling you have with the person you're paired with. I just want to give you a space to lift up what and honor what you wrote down and what you shared. But these are some questions that you can discuss with your partner. And so, but one thing I want to highlight is there's a resource in the palette that we're going to share at the end of our presentation that just highlights the value of name. And so the thing that you put in the middle is so valuable. My name meant something to me before I came to the States. Chinyere had meaning and meant God's gift. And so I would have loved a place where that would have been honored in the classroom versus just, becoming Juliet when I was in one space and then having to be Chinyere when I went back home. And so there's a great resource on like, how do we honor our students' names? They might not have a different name than what they have on the roster, but their name might have value in their culture. And so there's a great resource in there. There's also a book I'm going to share. It's called The Name Jar. If you haven't read it, basically it's a book that it's basically an example of there was a new student in the school. I believe she, I don't know where she immigrated from. It slips my mind, but her name was hard to say. And the teacher knew that other students were struggling to say the student's name. And to help the student with all good intention, the teacher thought, oh, I'm going to create a name jar where every other student can make new recommendations for your new name. And so students, yeah, you're nodding and so am I. I was like, nope, that's not what to do. And so students were like making all these recommendations. But the good part of the story is that as the story went along, the teacher and the student and the peer started to see the value in her name and said that, you need to keep your name. We want to learn more about it. I felt like if I remember the story correctly, the students were the one who learned before the teacher did. Like, no, she should keep her name. Like, we want to learn more about her. And so it's just a great example. That was a book I read to my students before I introduced what my name was. And then they started to share what their name meant in their culture. And so it was a learning experience for everyone. But that's one of the books that's in the resource. There's also other books that you can utilize, but I just want to honor the value of names because our name is so significant and important to our identity. And so as educators, how can we create a space where our students can show up as their authentic self? Let's see. Okay, technology, don't fail me now. Okay, here we go. So the next resource or visual that I want to share is the Wheel of Power and Privilege by Sylvia Duckworth, and it's connected to what you just did and what we just discussed. So the reason why I'm sharing this visual, because this is another reminder. So in this visual, the further you are on the outside of the wheel, the more marginalized you likely are in most cultures. And the more centered you are, the more likely you are to have access to power. And so this visual is just a reminder that although some of our identities may lie in the outer circle, how can we use that to better connect with our students that have similar identities or backgrounds? And so when we think about either where we sit, either in the marginalized area, there are ways to connect with our students. If we're sitting and where we have more power, how can we use that to be more allies of our students? And so just food for thought. I love this visual. I use it again. I use it more with my residents, my new teachers, because I really want them to be self-aware as to who they are and what they're showing up as when they're teaching our babies. When I say babies, I mean K-12. Even the ones in high school are still our babies. And so just food for thought. This is a great visual that they wrestle with and try to figure out, like, where do I land here? And how can I use my power to become an ally? Or how do I use my identities on the outer circle to connect better with my kids so they don't feel like they're in this alone? And so the rationale behind reflecting on our identities is because it's an important first step to creating an identity safe classroom. We need to know our students. We need to know their identities, and the activity we just did could be a way that you can find out more about who they are. And so in the next section, we're going to discuss the essential components of an identity safe classroom. So let's start by grounding ourselves with the definition. And so this comes from an article from Steele Vargas. Identity safe classrooms are those that validate students' experiences, their background, and again, their identities to promote not just academic, but also social success for all of our students. For me, value my identity would have helped me with the social success. I got the academics down pat. It was the fact that I just felt like the outsider constantly at school. And so that social success is so dependent and also has an influence or impact on the academics. And so within the research that I looked at, there are certain essential components of identity safe classroom. The first one being classroom relationships. This is so important. And so one thing I often share with teachers, which is so simple, is that how do you know your students? It could be something as simple as giving them a survey at the beginning of the school year. And the one question that keeps coming up that teachers ask that I think is so powerful is asking your students, what do you want your teacher to know about you? Like just kicking off the year, that could be just the one question. Like, what do you want me as your teacher to know about you as a student? How can I help you? I've done that with my students when I was in the classroom, and that gave me a really great foundation in establishing not only a relationship with my students, a connection, but also how I affirmed them and created an identity safe classroom for them. So just something as simple as that. What do you want me as your teacher to know about you as a student will give you somewhere to go with your students. How do you greet them? Do you do handshakes, high fives, morning routine, positive affirmations? Till today, I remember the positive affirmation that my third grade teacher had us recite every morning. It was, I believe in myself. I will stretch my abilities. I will feed my mind with new positive thoughts, and I will challenge myself to reach new goals. I still remember it as a 40-year-old, something I learned in third grade, and I still actually believe that. And so what positive affirmations are we sharing with our students that they will take into adulthood? Are we asking questions? I always say as teachers, whether you're new, veteran, in the middle, you're always taking an inquiry stance with your students and families. So we're not making assumptions. Oftentimes as teachers, sometimes we default to making statements or sometimes just like making assumptions based on what we hear from other teachers. But we need to take more of an inquiry stance and inquire about our students and our families. The other component, whoops, I'm going too fast. Hold on. So the other component is just daily check-ins. This can be something informal and it could be something that's embedded in your day so it doesn't feel like an add-on task. This could be something that's one-on-one. It could be one thing I found in the classroom, it could be a journal. So a teacher I worked with, what she did is that she had students journal daily, and she had them on a schedule where the journal became a conversation that students would have with the teacher, like what they did that weekend, what was very hard that day in class. And she had a schedule, like certain students, she would read their responses and respond back to them, like on Mondays, and certain students were on Tuesday. So students knew when the teacher was going to have a conversation with them as like a check-in through the journal. So they were excited. They would go get their journal, they would open it up because the teacher would respond and say, oh, I know yesterday was a hard day, today will be better. So journaling could be a way for you to dialogue with your students in a private, safe way. And so that's one thing that you could do. I know journals are used for other things, but I loved how this teacher used it in order to check in with her students. Another thing is celebrating interests, favorites, and talents. This doesn't need much explanation, but when I was a student, I wish my teachers would tap into my talents. Something I didn't share on my identity wheel is that I'm a performer. That's how I get, like, that's just my inspiration. Love karaoke, love performing. And some of my teachers took notice of that. And so they pushed me to volunteer or audition for the talent show. And so I will probably say that I have been Diana Ross and the Supremes, and I've also been Aretha Franklin as well too, RESPCT. And so I, tore the house down, standing ovation. But that was one of the things that made me like school, because there was something that that I was good at and my teachers saw and pushed me to do. So what hidden talents do our students have that we've seen and maybe just need a little nudge so they can have a safe space in school? And so because I did those performances, my teachers even recommended that I do a traditional Nigerian dance in front of the whole school. And that was hard for me to share that part of my culture, but I found friends who wanted to do it with me. And that was something that we did and we shared with the school. And so that's something that I'm proud of, that just, teachers knowing my talents, that helped me share a part of my identity with the whole school. And so little things can become bigger things that I will never forget. And your students will never forget as well too. So what are those hidden talents that we can honor and give a little nudge to for our students to share out? So another component of Identity Safe Classroom is child-centered teaching. So one thing or one recommendation or strategy you can use, or one call out, is listen to students' voices. So one teacher did an activity called Status of the Class. So at random times, she would ask, what's your status? And students were taught to raise their finger. So one would be very sad, or 10 would be very happy. And based on that, she would say, does anyone want to further explain? And this just had like an open dialogue. So she did this throughout the class day, like what's the status of the class? And then students had an opportunity to like have their voices heard. And so not every student shared, but she opened it up. Does anyone want to elaborate? Some students were fine with just like getting out their finger and their number where they're at. And some students wanted to share and elaborate on it. But just having that opportunity, students felt safer in that classroom. Teach for understanding. So here, through the use of critical literacy, teachers can empower students by teaching them to question text. And so when I was a classroom teacher, I would put books in front of my students, but I would teach them to interrogate the text. My students were interrogators of anything I brought in front of them, especially books. They constantly asked why. They wanted to know why things were. They rewrote books, but like with a different ending, a different beginning. What if this happened? And so I challenged my students to interrogate the things I put in front of them, because most of the things I did put in front of them, they weren't written for my students and so my students in mind. And so I wanted them to not only create a story that reflects them, but also interrogate what's in front of them. And so, I felt like the students I did have are going into the world better people, because now they're able to interrogate and like question things and feel empowered to do so. They should have a voice. The next component is just focus on cooperation. And so through literacy, how do we help students cooperate with one another? Whether it's partner reading, readers theater, acting things out. For older students, maybe it's a debate, producing a newspaper, interviews, doing a radio or blog or a script or some form where they all have to work together to produce something. These activities could be helpful in just preparing students for real life. Especially if we're working with middle school and high school students. These are skills that they're going to need in adult life. They're going to need to work with other people when they get into, work and working with teams and collaborating. They need these skills. And so why not create a safe space where they can practice it with us before they get out into the real world? And last but not least, classroom autonomy. The thing I want to emphasize here is UDL. If you're not familiar with UDL, Universal Design for Learning, it's a framework where you're able to give students multiple many options in how they engage, how they engage with information, what information we put in front of them, and how they're able to show us what they know. It doesn't have to be always written. Students can act things out. Students can say a speech. There's so many ways students can show what they know. And so what type of autonomy are we creating for students? One thing I say is that education should be something that is not done to students, but done with students. So what opportunities are we creating for students to walk alongside us as we're educating them? So it's not something that's constantly done to them, but with them. So basically, to sum up child-centered teaching, it's basically shifting the heavy lifting from the teachers to the students. And students are ready for it. We just have to have a gradual release as to what we're putting on them, but they're ready. And so the third component is caring classroom environment. So what does this mean to have a caring classroom environment? The first thing I want to emphasize is teacher skill. And this is just reflecting on your classroom management, because that's so key in the classroom. So when you're thinking about classroom management, there's a couple of questions I want you to think about. Are mistakes in your classrooms seen as learning opportunities? In some classrooms I've been in, no, like mistakes are seen as punitive. And unfortunately, I've seen even where students are being highlighted in a negative way for their mistakes, and they're embarrassed, and now they're not going to share anymore. And so teachers will come to me like, I noticed this kid's not talking anymore. Well, because you spotlighted them in a negative way. And so mistakes should be seen as learning opportunities. So as a student, my mistakes were seen as failures, not only to my teachers, but when I got home, my parents also felt that way. I felt like my parents have grown a lot more since when they were when I was a kid, but it was even seen as my mistakes were seen as failures. I didn't get a chance to fail forward. I was always constantly pressured to be perfect. And so I feel like the pressure now on our kids is just so much more. And so how can we reframe mistakes as learning opportunities? Our students' behaviors corrected without a spotlight. So my trajectory in the education system was far less worse than my brother's. He really had it. He had a challenging time. We didn't find out until later on that he was on the spectrum. So he went through his educational life not getting the appropriate support. So his behaviors were spotlighted as something bad. And school definitely wasn't a safe space for him. So he was hardly in school. Because if kids knew that, they were constantly going to get in trouble, why would they come to a space that's constantly showcasing the bad side of them? And so for him, he just didn't see school as ever being a safe space where he can show up as himself. The next component is the emotional and physical comfort of the classroom. So your classroom setup matters in creating an identity-safe classrooms. And so for me, my classrooms evolved. I did the chairs in a row with the chalkboard or the projector and teacher desks in the front. That's how I started teaching. And over the years, it morphed. My classroom, when I left the classroom, became a home. And so I got rid of all the desks. I started putting, students would bring pictures of their family, and our classroom would be filled with pictures from each student's family. We got bean bags, we got rugs, we turned off the lights and used lamps. One of the parents, and I taught in a charter school in MacArthur Park. And so a lot of my parents were working class. And so one parent was just like, she was getting rid of a couch. And so they brought the couch in the room. And so we had a couch in our classroom. One parent worked with the florist. And so every Sunday when they were going to throw away flowers that they weren't using, she would bring in on Monday morning. So we would have flowers in our room. So we got creative, but my room was not something sterile. It was a home. And because it was a home and we set it up that way, my students took care of their home. They took care of the classroom. And so just even morphing, little things matter. So what positive feelings or tone are you setting in your classroom? Like I wanted my students to feel safe. And what better place to feel, well, for some students, home is a safe space. And so I wanted to create that. Does your class feel like a family? Because we were a home, we felt like a family. Do your students have a sense of emotional safety? And so these are just things that I did. And of course, I surveyed my students as to what they wanted in the classroom, and we made it in little small increments. We made it happen by the end of the year. The last thing I want to emphasize is the attention to pro-social development. Basically, what this means is we have to teach students how to live and care for one another. This does not come automatic to all students. It's very hard because our students, I don't know what life they had prior to coming to me as their classroom teacher. So they might not know what it's like to be cared for or to even care for something else. And so sometimes we have to teach students. Again, we cannot assume that our students come with these skills. We sometimes have to teach them these skills. And so one thing I always emphasize is how students live in the classroom is just as important as what they learn. Yes, the standards, what they're learning, but how they live in my classroom is just as important as the standard or the objective that I'm going to teach them. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is diversity, the last essential component of an identity-safe classroom. So when we're thinking about diversity, we need to use it as a resource for teaching. And so what I mean by teaching is that, do our students see themselves in the curriculum? Do our students see themselves in the walls throughout our classroom activities? And the answer is no. Then maybe we should start surveying our students to see how can we better include them in the classroom. When I started teaching, by the end of my tenure in the classroom, I had a diverse set of literature where it not only reflected my students' background, but I wanted them to be knowledgeable of the world. We learned about so many different cultures because I want my students to go out into the world being ready to interact with anyone from any background. And so we read books from all across the world so students could understand what it's like to live outside of the US. Because I want my kids to have a worldly view, not just of themselves reflected in the text, but just understand how the world operates. High expectations and academic rigor. So what messaging are you giving your students about their work? Is it encouraging? Are you recognizing effort? Effort is something that's often mislooked. In my classroom, I told my students, even my residents that are in becoming new teachers, it's like, I always emphasize the importance of trying. Just try, meet me halfway, and we will go on this journey together. And so I always emphasize just trying and effort, and I would recognize effort because one student might be able to do one task very easily out really much effort, but another student might, it's taking the life out of them just to complete the first step. I am recognizing both students, but I'm also really spotlighting that student. Although they got to step one, I'm recognizing that at least they tried because I know that that's hard for them. So how much of that are we doing? A challenging curriculum. So curriculum should be meaningful. It should be interesting to our students. It should have higher level thinking questions. I'm by initially or how I got into education is through special education. And so although my students, there might have been in the fifth grade, at a first grade reading level, being at a first grade reading level did not stop my students. I knew that they were cognitively able, even though they couldn't read the text, I knew that they were able to cognitively engage with the conversation or with the book. And so I would constantly at rapid fire ask higher level thinking questions because I knew, they couldn't read it, but they could talk, they could answer these questions, these higher level thinking questions. And so I still exposed them because I wanted them to rise to the occasion, because with the appropriate supports, they would show up and they would thrive in this setting, and they did. And so the next thing I just want to emphasize that's connected to the books and the diverse literature is that, so when I think about diversity in the classroom, I think about this concept by Rudine Sims Bishop. She talks about creating mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors through books for our students. So when she says mirrors, she means, do students see themselves in the books that we put in front of them? When she talks about windows, she talks about, are students able to see other worlds and see how they are similar or different from theirs? Because that's also important. Our kids need exposure to the world. Sliding glass doors, are students able to step in and out of that world that we're exposing them to? And so this concept is not just for the benefit of the underrepresented or the marginalized student, but also for the students who typically see themselves in books. Like I wanted the kids who are the majority to get a glimpse of what it means to be from an underrepresented group or a marginalized group. I wanted my students to empathize with each other. I wanted to create better humans for the world. And so, creating this concept of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors through books just helped my students become better humans. And so I offer that to you. And so these are just two questions that, for the sake of time, we probably won't be able to, well, maybe we might do a quick chat chat alert, chat box response. Do our classrooms, lessons, instructional designs convey that each student's unique identity is seen, heard, valued, safe, or connected? And so take about a minute. And this could be a quick yes or no. I'm just trying to get a pulse based on what you've seen either in your classroom or through your colleagues' work, or just like in general in education. You don't have to talk about your classroom. Do our classrooms reflect these unique identities of our students? Okay. Every time I ask these questions, it's typically a no, which is so unfortunate because I'm waiting for that one presentation. I was like, yeah, yes, yes. And then I'm gonna like unmute and like find out, where are y'all teaching at? Because I need to see this and send teachers there. But unfortunately it isn't. So then the question to you is that how can you be the seed? How can you plant the seed at your school where this can grow and expand, where it's the expectation in every classroom? For me, a lot of the things that I've been exposed to was because I was a special education teacher and I was in many classrooms. And so because I was in many classrooms, I saw these cool things happening and I was the one who spread. I was like, oh, I saw Miss Brown doing this. Can we do this in this class? And so you can be that seed that's planting. Think of yourself as like a bee. You're like passing the pollen. You're pollinating all these classrooms with all these great resources. So be that seed planter, that person that just starts this work and like grows it. So then other people are very interested because our students need this. They need classrooms where they can show up as their unapologetic self, whatever that means for them. We're going to skip the second question just for the sake of time. I want to get through the rest of the content. But that's just something, food for thought to consider as we move on to the next section. Okay, technology. Okay. So now we're going to address our second learning target. And so this is learning how to incorporate funds of knowledge to design an inclusive learning environment. I didn't learn about this term, funds of knowledge, until like to my doctoral program. So I had been teaching for years and years and didn't really quite understand this topic until I got into my doctoral program. And so there are four key components of funds of knowledge. The first being academic and personal. So our kids are not, so in order to understand funds of knowledge, basically there's this premise that school reflects a banking model. So basically our students are like these empty vessels and we as teachers are just like dumping knowledge in them. And that's not true. Our students come in with tons of funds of knowledge that we need to tap into, bring out of them, and celebrate in the classroom. And so the four key components of funds of knowledge, the first being academic and personal background knowledge. So how can we as educators be intentional about incorporating our students' personal background in the classroom? It also includes accumulated life experiences. So I taught in New York and I taught first graders. And when I tell you these 6-year-olds probably experienced more of life than I had in the streets of New York, they had. And so they had so many life experience that was shocking to me. But I created a safe space where they could share that in the classroom. And so students often come into our classroom thinking that the home life and school life should be separate. And in some instances, it should be. But I created a space where if students wanted to bring the home life into the classroom, they could, whether it's their language, whether it's just something that they have from home, they could bring it in. And so because students feel like they need to be separated, they don't show up as their whole self. And so for some students, they want to keep home life and school life separate, and that's fine. But my classroom was not that. They were able to bring in their home life into the classroom. The other component of funds of knowledge is the skills and knowledge of just navigating everyday life. So how do we as educators find a balance in honoring our students' book smarts, but also their street and community smarts? And so there are two different things that we can honor in the classroom. As far as like the community, there were so many things I saw in the classroom that, would honor students' funds of knowledge. And so how can we do that? How can we learn about the community? How can we learn about know their book smarts, and how can we create a world where both can live in our classrooms? The last component is worldviews. Our students have a lot of views of the world, depending on their lens and how they're growing up. And so our students see the world through their own unique lenses, not ours. So we should be tapping into that and incorporating it as much as possible. And so a part of when I taught upper grade, I would always have a portion of our class where we would interrogate current events, because I wanted to see how it impacted them through their lens. And so we talked about it often in our classroom. How are these issues, topics impacting our students and their communities? And so with this slide, these are just strategies that you can utilize to help students, to identify students' funds of knowledge in the classroom. So maybe students can write an essay about their background. And maybe this is something we do at the beginning of the year, just like an easy write. Students can write essays about their background, or maybe do presentations about their interests. Like, what's something that's interesting to you? Create something, could be a blog, whatever you want to do, and present. This is a good way to get to know what your students' funds of knowledge are. Students can create projects that represent their family heritage. That's something I would have loved to do as a kid, but there was no space for that side of me, or that part of me, in the classroom. Teachers, this is something that's, you have to figure out with your school context. Teachers can conduct home or community visits. For me, for students that I found challenging to understand, once I was able to establish a relationship with the parent and was able to do a home or community visit, or specifically more a home visit, I better understood that student. Like, for example, there was a student who just notoriously never did work, or was late, or he just couldn't be organized. And then when I visited him at home, I found out that he didn't even have a space to even do his work. There wasn't a space for him to really have organization in his life. And so that helped me better understand that student and better supported him in the classroom once I knew his home situation or experience. And so, with home visit, now that we're all very savvy with technology, how can we maybe do a Zoom visit? That's actually a current assignment for my residents I'm teaching now. They're going out into homes, doing family visits, community visits, just to learn better about their parents and the students that they are serving. So they're not making assumptions, and they're operating based on facts and experiences. Teachers can also take note of specific experiences that students have had, or a different home or community practices in which students are involved. So finding that out and bringing that into the classroom. And so when we're integrating funds of knowledge, so it's like, how can we do this? Really, the way we can do this, sky's the limit. When we're integrating students' funds of knowledge, this can be done across all content areas, but it can also be easily applied to standards-based instruction. So one example of this is that in a classroom that I was in, the teacher, they were using like a math curriculum that was very word problem heavy. And so students were bored to death, because these problems were I was even bored in solving them. But what the teacher did is that she flipped it a little bit, and she changed the word problems and included students' names in the word problem, and started to flip it where it was like situations that they would experience in the classroom. So in New York, the corner store for us is called the bodega. So then the teacher created a problem around the bodega and included students in it. And students were just more so excited to solve the problem. Like, students knew what to do, but because the problem was boring, they didn't do the work. But as soon as we started talking about the bodega and a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich and paying for it and how much change you got, students started to light up, and they were like, oh, they can solve math. Yes, they can. Once the problem became about them and their community and their funds of knowledge, they were able to rise to the occasion. So I offer that up to you, because one little thing like that could really open up students. And so I just want to highlight this resource. I took a quick screenshot. The full toolkit, there's a funds of knowledge toolkit in the Padlet we're going to share at the end, that really goes through and gives you real life examples of how you can do this in the classroom. So here's one example of how you can integrate funds of knowledge in the classroom. And so the first one is the one, I'm going to go over the first one with you. So the home or community practice. So when Ruby's parents lived in El Salvador, the currency there was different. Same was in Nigeria. Our currency is Naira and Kobo. So they saved it. And we also did the same thing. My mom saved money when we came to the United States, so we would remember what it looks like. And so we saved money also, but this family did as well. And so the classroom application here was that this in math, where money in math is very common, but using different currencies would bring in their funds of knowledge, especially if we have other cultures in the classroom that we may not know about. So I would have loved if I could have brought the Naira and Kobo to classroom and explain like what's the value of it, do some math around it. So that is, math is like a simple way to like include our students' funds of knowledge in the classroom. But we're gonna drop the link to the toolkit for you if you want it right now in the chat, but know that it's in the Padlet that we're gonna share at the end. Okay, so to close out this section, I just want to remind you that the basic premise of funds of knowledge approach is that the classroom learning can be greatly enhanced when teachers learn more about their students and their students' households. So for you as educational leaders, what do you know about your student and their households? If it's not much, that's okay. I didn't know a lot starting off or even in the middle of my career. It wasn't until I started, towards the mid to end of my career, started to tap into those funds of knowledge and create a space where students felt like, again, they can show up as unapologetically me. And so the final section that we're going to dive into, or our learning target today, is now identifying ways to develop culturally responsive practices. And so this slide somewhat just speaks for itself, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit. So being culturally responsive means we have to understand the individual needs of our students. It's hard to be culturally responsive when you don't really know your student or their background. So the visual on the left, if you're not familiar with it, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we need to understand the individual needs of our students. So for example, like I would have students come into school like hungry. And because they were starving, they didn't have lunch, breakfast, they would not be able to do the morning activity that we had. And so before I even got to academics, I had to meet that basic need. Like, no, baby, go get some lunch, go get some breakfast, or here's a snack, here's an orange. Like I had to fulfill that basic need before I could even tap into academics. And so for me, for Maslow's, that's really my teaching was rooted. Are my students' physiological needs being met? Do they feel safe? Do they feel secure in my classroom? Do they feel like they belong? Am I, pouring into their self-esteem? I had to focus on that before I can get to the content. Because if that wasn't met for most of my students, it would be hard for me to teach. And so the visual on the right is more so Bloom's depth of knowledge, like all the different adjectives that we can find in objectives. And so what I usually say is, with my teaching practice, it became Maslow's before Bloom's. I had to meet the basic needs before I tapped into any type of academics for my students. And so I offer that up because I feel like classrooms need to be shifted, where now we need to first prioritize these basic needs. Me as an adult, you're not going to get much out of me if I'm hungry, or I would say hangry. I need food, I need snacks. And so, our students are kind of the same. They kind of need their basic needs met before we can get the most out of them. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to zip through these. So additionally, when we think about cultural responsiveness, it's also connected to real caring. So real caring is really based on the relationships that we build with our students. It's a little bit challenging to show real care for someone that you don't even have a relationship with. And so another component of real caring is just validating students' experiences. Real caring also means showing tough love when necessary. Like, I love my kids, but they knew when it was time. Like, I was going to show them tough love because I wanted to get them ready for the world. It's not all cookies and cupcakes. And so showing that tough love, there's an article in the Padlet by Zaretta Hammond called Culturally Responsiveness Starts with Real Caring. She describes tough love as a care and push that insists students rise to their fullest potential, bringing them into their zone of proximal development. So think of this as like a kid wants to eat, that a kid wants to eat donuts versus their vegetables for dinner. Like, you're not going to let the kid eat donuts because that's not good for them. You're going to like push them, give them that tough love. Like, no, you need to eat some vegetables because that's good for you ultimately. And so that's a little bit of what she talks about. And so she also says in the article, what happens if you don't feel cared for? Because she, studied different classrooms. In the words of Zaretta Hammond, if students don't feel cared for, ain't no learning happening. And I quote her. Really, no. And also there's a TED Talk by Rita Pierson where she says it's very hard for students to learn from someone who feels don't like that they doesn't care or like them. So if students feel like you don't care for them or like them, it's going to be hard for them to learn from you. And so what relationships are you establishing with students? And lastly, real care emphasizes the heart before the head. So the law of connection says that we first have to touch people's hearts before we ask them for a hand. So before we ever ask students to do all these things, all these tasks, we have to touch their hearts a little bit. We can't move students to action unless we first move them with emotion. John Maxwell is known for the famous quote, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." And that is so true for our students. Okay, so additionally, culturally responsiveness also entails creating a sense of belonging. So you have to build a sense of community that can help create a sense of belonging. So when students feel like they're part of a group, it makes them want to be more engaged, want to learn more. So as educators, we also need to create opportunities where students get to know each other, as this could help them just be empathetic to one another, connected to one another, more enthused to working with each other. Educators, we also need to be more inclusive. So our students feel more appreciated, they feel more supported, and they also have a rightful presence in our classrooms. Students have the right to be present in our classrooms. And so I want to leave you with that. But the final visual that we're going to, before we wrap up, I just want to stay in the concept of belonging and what it means. So this visual is from Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. So if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. I got to hear her speak at a women's conference last month, and it was like a surprise guest speaker, and everyone went nuts. But she dropped a lot of nuggets as well too. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to just review the slide on your own and choose a statement that most resonates with you when it comes to belonging. So it could be belonging in the school context, personal, relationship, professional relationship. The one that I resonated with was belonging as being accepted for you, fitting in as being accepted for being like everyone else. And so the reason why I chose that was that when I first entered the US education system, I worked really hard to fit in. And today I'm so proud to say that I have a home base where I truly belong, and every student should have that off the bat. So what's resonating with you? We're going to spend, let's see, we have 2 more minutes. What quote is resonating with you and why? And if you can indulge me and put it in the chat, I would really appreciate that. Yes, I love that one that was put in the chat. Diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. That is so true. I love that. Thank you for dropping that in the chat. We'll give it about 30 seconds. Anyone who wants to put a quote that's resonating with them. Again, it doesn't have to be in the school context. It could be a personal connection about belonging and fitting in the chat before we move on to our last slide for today.
Sorry, quickly before you move on, you mentioned a book. I think it said Atlas of the Heart. Was that the title?
Yes.
Who is that by?
Brene Brown.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I know we are done at 1:45, and so if there are quotes, please add them in the chat, but I'm going to move on to our last slide to close us out for today. And so as we wrap up our time together and just think about how we can embrace our students' identity to develop culturally responsive environments, we must be unapologetic in our pursuit for our students to have equitable access, to have limitless opportunities, to have high expectations, and just to have hope. Hope is just something that we take for granted, but a lot of our students are losing based on the experiences in classrooms. And so for me, if our is just creating that equitable access, limitless opportunities, and hope, then we need to be unapologetic as to how we go about it. And so that is our time for today. I did have time for questions, but it's so hard to squeeze all of this in 75 minutes. So I will stay on for a little bit. If there are any questions, I want to make sure I honor those questions and answer them as much to my ability. But for those who joined, please, I just want to thank you for being vulnerable and sharing in this space. And thank you for spending the last 75 minutes with me. But I will stay on if there are any questions. But I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and your afternoon.